Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. Hope you enjoy. Aldins, written by Arclight Mages. In a broad universe, and at the edges of what is known, there are many peoples, many places, and many tales. This is but one of them from the whole of what has been, is, and will be. It is not the height of galactic civilization, nor was it the beginning or the end, merely somewhere in between. Species warred, misunderstandings were had, breakthroughs accomplished, heroism marked and forgotten. But perhaps if there was a semi-constant amidst all of this, what was a near-constant, you might ask? Aldins Bar on Galactic Station 3. How could this place have been a near-constant if what was upon the Galactic Station 3, particularly given how many times it changed hands over the decades and even the centuries? Well, that's the trick. In the now, it's Galactic Station 3. Once upon a time, it was Terran Star Station Chameleon. Before that, it was Mars Tether Station 1. And what does all of this have to do with Aldins? Aldins was the first shop to ever open its doors aboard the station. Even in the now, where it is owned by a great descendant of the original Aldin, Aldin is one of the few places in galactic society that is considered one of the only true neutral grounds. The very powerful, the preeminently corrupt, the poorest, most honest of souls, and every being in between who knows and respects Aldins. It's said that criminals and the law can dine in peace together at Aldins. This isn't to say that there isn't a law at Aldins, but rather there are Aldins' two laws, and Aldins' laws are enforced by all. But all of this is a mere decoration to the now. Why? Because in the now, someone is about to break Aldins' law and discover what it means to be on the wrong side of it. "Another round, Aldin!" called out the Zert, called Blem. They were compatriots, had been steadily drinking and eating at Aldins for the past several cycles. They'd successfully robbed several vessels and various species, and decided to stop in the Galactic Station 3 to try and pawn some of their ill-gotten gains. They'd been reasonably successful, galactic policing and anti-piracy measures being poor even at the best of times. Aldin merely nodded and began pouring the group another round. His dark skin, unusual for this part of the galactic hub, but no being ever really remarked upon it. After all, what was the skin of a Terran compared to the glittering scales of the Justic, or the finely coiffed fur of the Terranian? No, Aldin was only remarkable because he was Aldin, at least as far as these customers knew. Aldin smoothly delivered the round to the table with a smooth elegance that stood him well. The Zert, opposed Blum, moved to slap Aldin on the back, but seemed to miss without apparent reason why. "Will that be all?" Aldin asked, the consummate professional. Blum nodded, a replication of Aldin's movements that they had picked up after several visits to this place. Aldin quickly withdrew and began attending to other patrons at the bar. Blum looked around at the bar and contemplated the other patrons. A few Terrans, probably Astro miners if they were any judge, stopped in for a quick round before they set back out into one of the nearby belts. A Rugap on some kind of social gathering with a Wanayan, a Pellic, and a Max. A few of the local constabulary, who appeared to be steadily ignoring the room while drinking heavily with the cheapest beverages that Aldin stocked. And a Zert that Blum both recognized and didn't, or rather thought they recognized, but couldn't be sure. The fringe was right, but the eyes seemed wrong. Those eyes seemed much kinder than the ones Blum remembered being on the other side of the weaponry of their last encounter. Unfortunately, one of the Zert that Blum was with also recognized the familiar Zert and yelled out, "Ollie, Murtham!" The Zert barked out, halfway spilling their drink. The familiar Zert looked over and Blum could see a moment of hatred spring to life in those eyes, and yet, just as quickly, the moment was gone and the eyes softened. Such a reaction was practically unlike any Zert in the whole of history. This, in fact, one of the only instances of a Zert putting aside the past grudge and so it wholly was remarkable in that regard. Sadly, this fact was about to be lost in the mix of what would follow. The Zert named Mutham collected a drink from Albin and walked over to Blum's seating and table. "What a surprise to see you here," Mutham said amenably. "We were just passing through. Couldn't resist stopping by this old place." Blum grinned, a jagged-toothed grin, slapping the table heavily, making even the heavy table and the genuine Terran wood boards beneath it bounce slightly. "Your ship has seen better days, Blum. Did you ever get around to fixing that Terran slip bypass like I told you?" Mutham gestured out the windows of the bar at the station, slowly rotating in the general direction of the docking ports. "Nah, upgraded we did. Got a new ship and all," bellowed one of the Zerts, who was seated near the Blum. Blum reached across the table and was about to hit the Zert before slowly leaning back and lowering the appendage. "Blum, have you truly fallen this far again?" Mutham seemed to be disappointed and yet condescending. Blum could feel the fringe flare involuntarily at that. I just had a few setbacks. At least this way I'm not stuck behind a desk, or worse, back in Zertia," they said curtly. Given that this was an age-lacking universal translation, practically live, at least for the most common folk, the rest of the bar could seem to sense the tension, and so was watching as something happening, if only for a moment. But for those who didn't speak Zerth, they might have simply been having polite conversation for them. "You're a thief and a coward, like I told you the last time I saw you," Mutham said in the Galactic Common, and very loudly. This got the attention of the whole bar, and perhaps more importantly, it got Aldin's attention. Blum considered a moment, considering where they were, considered their history with Mutham, considered the several days' worth of drinks and food weighing down their tail. "No," thought Blum, "not worth it. Anywhere else maybe, but not here." Unfortunately, Blum's companions were not considerate of just where they were given the same quantity of drink and food. The first opposite Blum stood in a hurry and moved to circle around Mutham. Mutham, for their part, looked shocked. The second stood, knocking over the heavy table with ease and spilling the accumulated empty food and drink containers to the floor. By this point, all 2 seconds of it, the rest of the bar had gone silent. "We should take your fringe for taking to the captain like that," the second said in Zerth, wavering somewhat unsteadily. "Tipka, sit back down," commanded Blum, who was genuinely starting to worry about what was about to happen. "No, Captain, this one here needs your lesson and respect." Tipka, an exceptionally heavy Zert with the best of times, took 2 thumping steps forward, barely kicking aside 2 of the drink containers and crushing one of the food containers beneath their foot. "Stop! We're in Aldins!" came the halfway cry from Blum, who seemed almost frightened, but remained seated. "Good! No law to stop us!" Tipka lunged and grabbed Mutham by the crown. The first Zert had circled behind, grabbed Mutham's tail, as if to try and stretch the offended Zert between them. They didn't make a move any further than that, at least not voluntarily. It seemed to be only a moment, and yet somehow they both yelped and released Mutham, who dropped to the floor. Both seemed intent on nursing their hands as they tried to figure out what just happened. Aldin was standing there with a big hunk of the genuine Terran wood in his hand. "I believe it is time you paid your tab," Aldin said in a calm, almost Gentile-accented common. "Huh?" came the only thing that came to Tipka's mind. "You'll pay your tab, and you will leave," Aldin commanded. Tipka would still not be in their right mind, and so they reached towards Aldin to grab him by the head. Strangely, like the friendly backpat attempted from earlier, this missed, despite nothing apparent from Aldin. Aldin extended a hunk of wood upwards and brought it down with the almost sickening thud upon the head of Tipka. Tipka either couldn't dodge it or chose not to. Whatever the case, Tipka's fringe went pale before they collapsed to the floor in a barely contained heap of scales. The first Zert, who had been holding onto Mutham's tail, appeared somewhat frightened at this point. Mutham, to their credit, had retreated to the bar behind Aldin. Aldin pointed the hunk of wood to the first Zert. "You will pay for both your tabs now and leave," Aldin commanded. The first Zert merely nodded, the reality of the situation seeming somewhat normal, although they couldn't understand why their captain hadn't moved from their spot. Aldins snapped his fingers and an employee appeared with a table holding a bull which was proffered to the lone Zert. To say the Zert's fringe bulged in surprised amazement and utter terror in the same instant would be an understatement. Never before had a Zert felt like this, and likely never again. At least, not in any bar. On a battlefield, perhaps. This can't be right, the Zert protested in an almost broken common. Ah, but it is. You're not the first to break my laws, nor will you be the last. But this is my bar, and you will pay what's owed, Aldin said in that same calm, aristocratic accented galactic common. Aldin gestured with a hunk of wood to the sign over the bar that was translated into 35 different scripts, all of which could readily be translated into any of the other most commonly used scripts. They all spoke of the same 2 laws, the exact 2 laws that Zert was in the process of breaking. The Zert appeared to try to think, only to fail, try again, fail again, and still end up reaching for one of the worst possible conclusions any being in the room could have imagined. No, said the Zert, almost as a whisper at first, before repeating it louder. No! Blum and Mutham winced in sympathy as the hunk of wood caught the Zert across the gut, lifting them slightly and throwing them to the side and to the floor, landing hard. The employee who had presented the tablet to the Zert pressed the tablet forced confirmation and placed the moaning but not unconscious Zert's indent hand against the payment form. The tablet chimed and then issued a kind of sad tone. Several people in the bar already knew what it was. Insufficient funds. Do you wish to use Galactic Bank credits? Asked the tablet. The Zert still appeared less than happy about being conscious, but eyed the tablet with suspicion, glanced over at Aldin, back at the tablet, and decided that the bank was a lesser opponent. Thumbing the affirmation on the tablet, it chimed happily, and the employee moved away gently, almost at odds with all else that had just happened. The 2 Zerts were carried out the front door and placed on a nearby transport in the direction away from Aldins. Aldin's hand seemed to empty of the hunk of wood, and he quickly set about putting the table back into place and collecting the various empties, an employee helping him. Would you like a replacement drink? He asked Blum. Blum swallowed and nodded. A few moments later, a replacement drink was in front of them, and Mutham was across from them, holding a similar drink. Well, I see you remember some of the things I taught you. Mutham seemed smugged. Don't try your luck. You won't always be in Aldins, and neither will I, Blum said, a bit rougher than intended. Come now, if you got a new ship, who better to look after it than me? All I ask is to keep it legitimate, Mutham said. Not enough currency in it, muttered Blum. You just need to look in the right places. Mutham gestured towards the bar with the drink. Blum looked over at the bar where Aldin winked. Blum gave it some thought. Actually, Blum gave it a lot of thought, far more than one would expect from a Zert. All right, you're in, and no rough stuff. Blum flared their fringe as was tradition. Of course not. We're in Aldins after all. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 channel members and patrons. Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Barkey, It's Difficult to Pronounce, Lord Azrakal, and Arcadian.